who has longtime ties to GM and the auto industry. She represents Detroit and is in Southfield, Michigan this morning. Congresswoman, you have said these are the most important negotiations you witnessed in your lifetime. You have longstanding ties to these automakers. Is it really more significant than when the Bush and Obama administrations bailed out the automakers?
Yes, it's far more significant, and I'll tell you why. Those days were, these companies were facing bankruptcy, and quite frankly, it was because of management decisions. And the auto workers were scared for their jobs, and they stepped up, and they gave away their cost of living increases to help. They gave in 2008 and 2009. Now the companies are back in a strong position, but we're really where the rubber hits the road. Margaret, we are in a transition of this industry. We're competing in a world marketplace that we are, some of the countries in Europe, you'll see in the last quarter, the electric vehicle sales are more than 50% of the sales. That's what we're competing in. And we have to make sure the worker is part of this transition. It should not be either or, it needs to be both. We gotta make sure the worker can afford to buy that electric vehicle, that they're gonna have the support that they do. And we've gotta make sure we're paying a fair and decent wage. And all workers, everybody in this country benefits when workers are paid well.
But those electric vehicle battery manufacturing plants, so many of them are joint ventures that they are partially foreign owned. They are not unionized. That's a choice. How do you reverse that?
Well, I mean, that is something that's very real. And on the table right now is really, there's probably only one battery plant that may be under the master agreement. We've got to, it's not an easy question. It's not easy to deal with. And I also want to say something else that everybody doesn't understand. Tesla does have a huge discrepancy in what they're paying their employees. And most people in this country can't afford a Tesla. Even a lot of executives can't afford to buy a Tesla. But the fact of the matter is that most at a Toyota, I've looked at the studies, almost all workers at auto plants benefit from where these negotiations go. This is where the rubber hits the road. We got to figure out how we're going to do this transition, how we're going to go from the transition of an internal combustion engine, and pay people who are making that battery a decent wage, similar to what they're making for ICE. And there are going to be new jobs and different jobs that are going to come from this transition. But it's not a talking point moment. This is a real, intentional, hard moment.
President Biden said he was sending his staff to Detroit. They're not there right now. You just heard Shawn Fain say something about the White House injecting themselves into negotiations. Do you think the president, White House should intervene?
First of all, I do not believe that the president should intervene or be at the negotiating table. I've said that from the beginning. But, you know, if anything that the pandemic has just taught us is that, like, who's in an office and who's working. I talk to Gene Sparling multiple times a day and have all summer. I don't think they've got a role at the negotiating table. I think every one of us that are policymakers and other stakeholders need to understand what these issues are, what we can do to support those discussions at the table, and what we need to do coming out of these to help make a strong, viable, competitive industry that's employing American jobs. And I'm not going to let these electric vehicles be built in China. Even though someone else says they want them built 100% in China, I'm fighting to make sure they're here with good paying American jobs.
Well, you know, Michigan, I don't have to tell you this, that it is a competitive state. We're going into an election year. I just asked Shawn Fain what it would take for the union to endorse President Biden, who says he's the most pro-union president ever. And he said that has to be earned. That's a pretty big statement.
Well, first of all, he's also said that Donald Trump would be a disaster, and I could go into that at length. But I really have to tell you that I think that we got to keep these two issues totally separate. I'm really worried about what's happening at the table, and that it is going to determine the future of the auto industry in Michigan. I want to keep presidential politics out of this and do what's right from a policy perspective. Then we can talk about the presidential election. Michigan's a competitive state. I keep telling you all, it's a purple state. It's not a blue state. But when we get a good agreement that keeps America strong, keeps our workers strong, then I think they'll know who they're going to support. And they're going to support someone that supports the American worker.
Sure, but Democrats love to say
And that's
that
somebody,
they
by
are
the way, that doesn't care about.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Well, no, I mean, everybody's like, Donald Trump says he's going to swoop in and do a pickup. I mean, he doesn't care about their pay raises. He doesn't care about COLA. He doesn't care about retirement. He doesn't care about pensions. He doesn't care. I mean, last time he campaigned in Michigan, he told the companies they should move to other states where they pay people less money. So I think that we all as policymakers need to understand the issues. How do we support this transition so that we are staying competitive in this country? But I want to do presidential politics after this is done at the table and we are keeping a strong, viable industry, which is make the workers part of the success.
Debbie Dingell, Congresswoman, I appreciate your insight. Face the Nation will be back in a minute. Stay with us.
There's John.
As for Trump, just over half are sure he'd finish his term if returned to the White House. Joining us now to discuss it is our Elections and Surveys Director, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, good to have you here. The Vice President, Kamala Harris, told me last week Joe Biden is going to be just fine. Doesn't seem like voters are convinced.
They're not entirely convinced, and there is concern, and that speaks to uncertainty in this way. When people don't think that a candidate is going to finish a second term, they're less likely to vote for that candidate, and that's certainly happening in the case of Joe Biden. It's also happening with Donald Trump. Now, there's also a component here when people are asked, do you think these candidates are physically fit enough, are mentally, cognitively fit enough? And neither one of them inspires overwhelming confidence here, but it's not accruing well for the president right now. You see a substantial number of voters who aren't sure that he is, and that is helping Donald Trump, those voters switching. And, even in the case of Donald Trump, you don't have an overwhelming number of voters who think he is physically fit or cognitively fit. The reason that all speaks to uncertainty is that, well, people don't like uncertainty, but when they're making a presidential vote, you're thinking about, well, if this person isn't going to finish their second term, then what am I going to get for my vote? And that creates a new wrinkle in the decision process.
So what else do voters say they want from a president?
Well, this is important because you start with Joe Biden. Voters have always told us they think he's calm, they think he's predictable. Those qualities really met the moment in 2020 during the pandemic when he was running against then President Trump. Well, today they want more. They want someone that they think is tough. They want someone that they think is energetic. And those are qualities they do not ascribe to Joe Biden, but Donald Trump does do better on those qualities. And that's important. And then there's this. Donald Trump's voters overwhelmingly say one reason they're voting for him is they think things were better under him. And that relates to the economy. It relates to people's finances. I mentioned the pandemic. We look at whether people say they're doing better or worse now than they were before the pandemic. And people say that they are not. By 2-1, they say that they are still worse off than better. And those people are voting for Donald Trump. That's kind of classic. If you're not better off, you vote for the out party.
It's interesting people are focused on those first years of the Trump presidency rather than the pandemic years of the Trump presidency. But we're really early in this, Anthony. Why are you polling when we don't officially have a Republican nominee, a head-to-head race?
Yes, it is very early. But number one, you have Donald Trump so far out in front in the Republican primaries. The indictments haven't hurt him. They've only really helped him. So you have this presumption that we're going to get a rematch. And that is unusual. And look, anytime you have something that's unusual, you want to understand it as soon as possible. Another point for context here, right? Democrats are going to look at this. That is a shift, as you said, from Biden's fairly comfortable 2020 win to where it is now. In the summer of 1995, Bill Clinton was down to Bob Dole. In the summer of 2011, Barack Obama's disapproval rating was hitting all-time highs. Both of them turned it around and got reelected. Okay, maybe that gives Democrats hope, but this certainly is a shift from what we saw in 2020.
So what is it that people think is at stake?
Well, I should also say we're pulling on a race people don't seem to want.
Okay.
Which is to say, when we ask people how they feel about getting this rematch, they said that they think that means politics in the U.S. is broken. And, but look, having said that, they also see really high stakes here. And they say that not only is democracy and rule of law potentially at stake, but maybe in a sign of the times, it's only going to be safe if their guy wins.
Of course. Anthony Salvanto, thank you for sharing your insights. We'll be back with a lot more Face the Nation, so stay with us.
Ever
What's happening in Ukraine right now?
How would you describe the fighting at the front?
60 Minutes wide-ranging interview with President Zelensky, the season premiere of 60 Minutes tonight.
Finally. Flood of freaking commercials.
Welcome back to Face the Nation. We are joined now by the Republican chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner. Good to have you here.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
A lot to get to with you, but I want to start on what's happening within the next 8 days. We may be facing a government shutdown. Back in June, it took Democratic votes to push through that debt ceiling deal. The Speaker announced an impeachment inquiry. Isn't this going to make it harder for you to work across the aisle and to do something like avoid a government shutdown?
No, not really. There are a number of things, obviously, where there's bipartisan consensus. One of which, as you indicated, was the budget debt deal. Kevin led in that. The American public wanted a change from the Biden policies of spending, working on closing the border, addressing the issues of China. And he delivered. And the American public have given the House, with a small margin of Republicans in control, the Senate, Democrats in control, small margin. They expect bipartisan solutions. Kevin has led in delivering those. This is certainly one where everyone wants the government to be functioning. We want to adhere to the deal.
You got 8 days.
The country, yes.
So what do we do here? I mean, is this a continuing resolution situation? Because it doesn't seem like House Republicans are on the same page.
Well, as you just said, it is probably going to result in the end in a bipartisan solution. We're going to pass a spending bill. That's what is going to be required, and we're going to do it.
But it will require Democrats. You don't think the impeachment inquiry will cost you?
Well, again, there are things that are important to the country and that for which people come together. And I think this is one of those, that the country came together on the that debt budget deal. And at that time, investigations were already ongoing into the Biden family businesses. And I think that's certainly something that's expected that will continue.
One of the issues for some members of your caucus is the continued support for Ukraine. And we know President Zelensky is going to be here this week. Can you meet with him and tell him he's going to get the $13 billion that the White House is asking for? Can you get your caucus to support it?
Well, the House certainly the Republican caucus overwhelmingly supports aid for Ukraine. There will be issues over what the administration has asked for and what Congress ultimately gives. Speaker McCarthy has made it clear that the White House should have come to us and worked on what the package was and not just sent it to Capitol Hill for dispensation. But at the same time, Zelensky's a great spokesperson. He really makes the case better than anyone that this is a fight for democracy and that Putin's goals are well beyond Ukraine, into Eastern Europe and into the Baltics. Having him here is going to be very, very persuasive. The last time we had votes on the House floor on the issue of aid for Ukraine, nearly 300 members voted in affirmative out of 435. A majority of the Republicans voted in the affirmative, and I think that will continue.
But this is not going to complicate the vote to keep the government funded and open.
Well, again, this is another essential item that we have to do, and
right.
this was not included in the budget
right.
Debt limit deal, with an understanding though, because everyone knew. I mean, this is on your TV sets every day.
Yeah.
Everyone knows this is ongoing, and this is going to require U.S. support. Zelensky has higher approval rating in the United States than any nationally elected official. Him coming here, I think, will be very persuasive.
even to the more conservative members of your caucus?
Well, not everyone has to vote yes. If you get 300 out of 435, that's certainly overwhelming. I think we're going to be back there again.
So do I hear you saying no government shutdown?
I didn't say that. I said we're going to pass a spending bill. We'll just have to see when.
So what will be? Okay.
Margaret is good about going a bit over the limit in how that she is very persuasive as an interviewer whenever it comes to her interviewing versus various politicians. That's what makes her good. And she is strong-minded. She's direct. A lot of times, maybe even too direct. But the fact of the matter is, if you're going to be that good interviewer, that's what it takes to basically get to where you want to go. That way, maybe you can possibly get some sort of a decent answer out of the person that you're interviewing. Because if you just sit up there and let the person that you're interviewing take over the whole conversation, then basically you ain't got a true interviewer. You got to have an interviewer to have an interview. And Margaret meets that criteria.
Just stay tuned.
The White House is going to announce additional capabilities. They've said that. Do they get the long-range missiles to Ukraine that they're asking for, the ATACMS?
I hope they do. I mean, the administration has consistently said no to everything Ukraine has said multiple times publicly and then ultimately recanted and provided them. What we know from this era of the conflict, Ukraine is still on the offensive, which was the goal of the offensive. Russia is on the defensive. Mm-hmm. There are a number of impediments that are making it difficult for that offensive to push Russia out. And at the same time, Ukraine has to get additional ground and or longer range weapons to put Crimea at risk, which is where some of the assaults are coming from that are killing Ukrainians.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly important that we provide them this capability.
Your committee was briefed by the White House within the past week about this expected prisoner swap with Iran. Their diplomatic mission shared with us the list of Iranians they expect President Biden to pardon. Are you comfortable with this swap?
Well, I mean, when we received our briefing at the committee, obviously we made known our concerns.
This is a very controversial subject matter pertaining to the American people in regards towards compromising or negotiating with terrorists or people that's similar towards terrorists, which in actuality breaks all principles of that in which what we have ever established. And don't get me wrong, I realize that lives is very, very significant in other parts of the country pertaining to American lives. But, you know, I've made a statement just within the past week or so since the anniversary of 9/11, the 22nd year of anniversary of 9/11, that what our military should have done before the second plane ever hit the second tower, that our aviation forces should have been Johnny on the spot, and they should have blown that airplane into smithereens before it ever even got close to that other tower in New York. And one may be asking, well, what if you was on the plane? Exactly. Good riddance. Because the needs of the many in military statuses, the way that I was raised under a World War II drill sergeant, always exceeded above and beyond the needs of the few. And whenever you have a government that no longer operates under those pretenses, then you have a government that is no longer operating in the priority form for the needs of the many versus the needs of the few. Once more, I realize that those lives over in Iran, it don't matter if it's Iran, don't matter if it's Russia, don't matter if wherever it is, that those lives are important. And it wouldn't matter if it was my son or my granddaughter or whoever over there, or even myself. Once you leave the continent of the United States, especially with things being as topsy-turvy as they are today. Since COVID, since everything else has occurred, you are taking it upon to yourselves a risk. You can say whatever you want to about you being approved through visa of getting whatever that you need to get to be able to go to wherever that you need to go. But the bottom line is this: whenever you leave the Continental, you are taking it upon yourself a higher risk as a United States citizen of possibly never coming back home. Now, if you're going to get in a flight and you're going to go from here to Alaska or here to Hawaii, that's risky enough towards being around a bunch of foreign exchange people that you don't know if they got COVID. You don't know if they're going to be terrorists on the plane. You don't know if some sort of an incident's going to occur. That's risky enough. But whenever you go from here, and it don't matter if you're going to the Philippines, don't matter if you're going to one of our loyal ally countries, you're still taking a risk. I don't care how sound that the guarantee may be coming from Pan Am or whatever airline industry that you use. There is a substantial risk there that one must always put into play. The same way if you get in your automobile and you start down the road, there's always a risk that you'll be involved in an accident. And there's always that risk that it may be a major accident. And it's always that risk that you may not survive that major accident. There's always certain risk involved in doing just about anything. From everything to anything, there's always risks. And whenever a person leaves the Continental, they take it upon themselves about that risk. What you're fixing to hear in what this particular administration has done, a lot of people finds to be appalling. And to be quite honest with you, I can relate and understand why. I really can. Because whenever you go to negotiating with terrorists or people like terrorists, that is opening up a brand new venue of now others pursuing and doing the same. Once more, the needs of the many, according to the way that I was trained, has always exceeded the far course of the few. Now, if it was really, really, really somebody important over there, let's say like Elon Musk or one of our vice presidents or somebody else that is very, very valuable to the American people, then maybe there would be an opportunity to compromise those policies, to say, you know what, we really cannot afford to lose this particular person because this particular person is their status quo is a whole lot more significant than the average old Joe that got lucky and got him an airplane ticket and went to wherever that they was going. Not to say that that person's soul is any more valuable than the other person's soul, because it's not. Looking at it from a spiritual level, we are all equal at the foot of the cross. But you have to admit, certain people that have been lucky, maybe they inherited their positions, maybe they was voted into their positions, maybe they worked for their positions, but you have to admit that certain people hold certain statuses above and beyond any and everybody else. Not to say that that person is worth more in the eyes of God. That's kind of like a lot of people debate on sin, whether or not it's a big sin or a little sin or a tiny itsy bitsy sin. According to God, one sin is just as equal to the other sin, and it sounds absolutely fictitious in our minds to think that God would say that murdering a young child, an innocent life, would be on the same level as somebody stealing a candy bar. Well, you have to be practical in the way that you look at that, first of all. And there's no doubt that God looks at the person that has committed to sin towards killing an innocent life a whole lot more worse than what he does somebody that's going to steal a candy bar in a restaurant. I mean, in a retail store somewhere. You have to look at it in a practical sense, but at the same time, sin is sin. And sin is what divides us and separates us from God Almighty. And that was the teachings of the Lord Jesus Christ, and that was the whole primary purpose, that Christ come to be a mediator for us, standing in the middle as a representative for us, that it's only through Christ and by Christ that allows for us to be able to go boldly before the throne and still pray to the Father, and the Father still recognizing towards who we are through the Son. And that's the only reason why that the Father would even begin to, I ain't going to use the word compromise, but modify those original examples that he displayed back in the Old Testament. Back in the Old Testament, not only was God very, very strict in not wanting to be with somebody that lived a life of sin, but in some cases, God would allow, let's say, Daniel or Job to go through certain things that ordinary people wouldn't never go through, in trying them people to see just exactly where they stood. And it wasn't that God was promoting the damage upon to Job, pertaining to his family turning on him, pertaining to all the sores that come up onto his body. And then there towards the last, according to the Bible, his own wives looked at him and said, "Why don't you curse God and die?" And that was the pivoting point whenever Job made a decision in front of his wife as he was dying with sores. His friends had abandoned him. He'd done already lost everything that he ever tried to work for in his entire life. And Job looked at him and said, may the worms devour my body. I will not curse my Lord and my God. And once that decision was made, that's whenever God started blessing Job. And Job ultimately, there towards the last, according to the Bible, wound up getting 7 times more valuable in the world sense towards what he ever thought about before all them tests or trials ever took place in his life. Now, did God bring the boils? Did God bring all the misery? Did God bring all the other stuff? No. It says very, very frank in the Bible, where Satan come to God and debated God and said, "I can't do nothing with your servant because you put a protected hedge around him." And God thought for a second. He said, okay, you can do whatever you want to Job, my servant, to prove that you're wrong, Lucifer, the Antichrist. But you cannot take his life. You can do everything to him that's right next to the edge of taking his life, but you cannot take his life. So whenever it talks about in the Bible how that Satan will come down in great wrath, because he knoweth his time is short. Those are words that should never, ever, ever be taken lightly. Because if you really analyze the dialogue of Jesus Christ, he never assumed his adversary on a light, moderate scale. He always looked at the enemy towards being the enemy. And that's one of the areas that our government here in the United States has failed in recognizing, that we have people that's not only across the pond that wants to bring harm and hurt and destroy us, but we have people right here amongst us in our own neighborhoods, in our own workplaces, that wants to bring harm and hurt to us because we're not of the same caliber. You've got 2 different calibers upon to the planet. You have the ungodly and you have the godly. Well, the non-godly, those that are demonic, They can say whatever they want to say about not hating nobody, but I guarantee you something within their soul growls, literally growls at a true born again Christian, because they see us as being the enemy, even though it was their leader pertaining to Lucifer that challenged God and struck the first blow. They're not worried about fairness. They're not worried about what's right or wrong. They're just worried about trying to eliminate us. That way, it will make themselves look superior. That's where we're at right now. That's the reason why I continue to keep preaching on this and continue to keep telling people this by using different illustrations towards basically the world right now, especially the Christian world, is under an invasion. And if we're not being invaded politically, we're being invaded spiritually. And if we're not being, in actuality, the spirituality part of it is the core origin of all of it. But if we're not being invaded by diseases, we're being invaded by raunchy politics or corrupt politics. We're being invaded by all the foreigners coming over to America. We're being invaded pertaining to us not being able to balance our budget, where they're talking about shutting down the government again, I think for about the 70th something time since 1980. If we're not being invaded by that, we're being invaded by laziness. We're being invaded by people that can't think for themselves. We're being invaded by people that has allowed for this stuff to get out of hand the way that it has here in America. We are under an invasion. These are the things that Donald Trump was trying to explain to the people regarding building the wall, and he was laughed at. Well, now, since they got Donald Trump out of office, look at what has happened to this particular administration regarding the illegal immigrants coming from the southern border.
I mean, whenever you put a price on American heads, you get an incentive for people to take more hostages.
These are $6 billion in frozen
these are
oil revenue.
Billions and billions of dollars, and so that's a concern. The administration says we're really only giving them their own money, but it's still money that they didn't have. The other aspect is that these monies can be used to support terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas, and venturesome actions of Iran. The administration says this is limited to humanitarian aid, but they also acknowledge that funds are fungible, which means they can move them around and it will aid them in being able to do other things. So people are very concerned as to what this is as a pattern. The administration's answer is people shouldn't go to Iran. I certainly want to echo that also. People should not be going to Iran.
You're not moving on a travel ban, though.
No, not at this time, but I think that people seeing this should know that that they're at risk and they shouldn't go to Iran.
I want to ask you, because you...
Just what I said, they're at risk. You're in an uncontrollable environment that the United States government can no longer guarantee your safety, pertaining to you going to another country and then returning back on basically the same way that you went there. And it's that way with Russia. I would not advise anybody right now to go to Russia. A matter of fact, we have put very tight restrictions on people going to Mexico, especially vacationers going down towards Cancun, Mexico. There is high risks, and then there are moderate risks. But there are a level of all risks, no matter where you go, of things breaking down, because we're no longer living in the same world that we was living in, let's say 25, 30 years ago, even 40 years ago, towards it taking a certain amount of time for things to occur. Because of AI, because of social media, things happen now today in a warp speed rapid succession, indicating that you could be on a little island somewhere that's dedicated toward being some sort of a country somewhere, and all of a sudden something happens, something flare up, and the next thing you know, total chaos break through. And because it's broke through, now they put a ban on everybody, a lockdown, and you may be one of the ones that's over there during the time that the lockdown occurs. Now, 40, 50 years ago, that would have almost been impossible for it to have happened that quickly. It could have still happened 40 or 50 years ago, but not as quickly as what it does today. And that's things that a lot of people just not put into the equation whenever they leave the American soil and go to other places of the world. Like I said, Alaska, that's a pretty much so guarantee that you're going to return back home. If you leave me here and go to the islands, Hawaii Islands, that's a pretty much guarantee that you're going to make it back home. But that still doesn't guarantee you that you're not going to be caught up in some sort of a dilemma in transit, either going or coming back. Because in today's society, as crazy as the world has become, I don't think that you can put a guarantee on nothing no more. It's that unstable. It really is. And it's unlike any other time that I have ever lived in at the age of 62, that I wish and pray to God that I wasn't having to be in this era right now. But I'm here, and there's nothing that I can do about it other than to grin and bear it. This is what I continue to keep harping on pertaining to the corporate so-called church world here in America that did not pick up where they should have picked up on pertaining to the Windmill Ministries missions. And in reality, the ministry did not fail the American people or the world in general, especially pertaining to the Christian world, but it was rather the other way around. It was the people that failed the ministry, because as long as I was out there hammering again and again and again and again for over 30 years, somebody should have recognized that this man obviously has strong, passionate feelings about his calling towards wanting to represent the Lord Jesus Christ. But they still did not take hold of that passion or that compassion in Alamo Baptist Church, or in Kenton, Tennessee, or in Sharon, Tennessee, or in Cydonia, Tennessee, or in Weakley County courts up here in Weakley County, or in Kentucky or Oklahoma, or in other places that I've been at where they have purposely tried to sabotage, would be a good word, assassinate my character. And as we're sitting back, and as I'm telling my story, I'm explaining the good along with the bad. Now, in America, they have been so spoiled. Oh, that's taboo. You're not supposed to tell your superior officers or the people that's worth a whole lot more money than you. You're not supposed to tell them how to run their business or where they failed at or where they didn't fail at. Well, where is that in the playbook? There's nowhere in the playbook that it says that a common Joe cannot speak truth to power. And I have been demonized and dehumanized on account of that. Just like whenever I went out to Oklahoma and Waco, Texas, and I discovered the truth about what went on, rather than me receiving a medal from the president of some sort, or rather than me getting some sort of a decree from the Tennessee governor, I ain't got none of the above. Now, that's the way things are supposed to be handled whenever you're working for the benefit and the well-being of the American citizens. But to this day, I've still not received neither nor. As far as I'm concerned, I'm still an outcast. As far as I'm concerned, the message that I continue to proclaim to the world here in America, they don't support it. I haven't had a flood of emails. I haven't had a flood of mail coming to 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255. I ain't had a flood of people coming and knocking on my door saying, Dennis, we're going to partner up with you. We're going to help you succeed in your compassions and your passions that you've had now for over 30 plus years. We're going to support you in those endeavors. I still have yet to get that. So because of it, whenever it comes to converts, there's been other prophets of God that's been called of God to bring forth a divine message in the Bible that never obtained not one convert. Not one. They was rejected. But we can see by the rejection during that generation of people that rejected that person that society suffered immensely. And of course, one of the main examples of that would be the rejection of prophet Noah. Noah was a prophet of God. Noah had the heart of God. And because of it, God instructed Noah, because of the wickedness that was going on the planet, to prepare for destruction upon to the planet. In the meantime, Noah preached while he was driving every nail of what was going to occur. And they laughed, and they made fun, and they ridiculed, and they demonized, and they dehumanized not just Noah, but his whole family. See, that's another thing that most Christians don't understand in looking at past historical events. Just like Jesus Christ, do you really think that it was only Jesus Christ that received persecution coming from the general public? Absolutely not. It was his mother and Joseph, his stepfather, and any and everybody around Jesus, including his disciples, that received the same type of persecution and ridicule that even his disciples, after Jesus rose from the grave and descended back up into the heaven after the 40th day, went through great horror, peril, to the degree that most of them got assassinated because of that in which what they believed. That demonic movement was so powerful during that time that it had reached a point of secrecy to be able to communicate, and that's whenever basically people took on using signs and using different ways to communicate. And where the fish symbol come from in the Bible wasn't the fact that Jesus fed the 5,000 with only 7 fishes, but it had reached a point that you could not communicate with people about God and about the Lord Jesus Christ, that whenever you approached them, they would either physically draw with their hand or take their foot and draw half of a fish symbol. And if the other person was trustworthy enough and they already knew what was going on, they would finish the course of completing the rest of the fish symbol, symbolizing the fish, and then those two people could talk together without having to worry about condemnation falling up into your life because you wanted to discuss something about the Lord Jesus Christ. The powers of evil have always been in the world. And if you don't believe that, and if you don't accept that, then obviously you're either out of touch with reality or you're only playing games regarding the spirituality of good versus evil, evil versus good. I've said this before, I'll say it again. We are basically pawns in the middle of a spiritual warfare. And in lots of cases, pertaining to what goes on, we can be considered collateral damage. Collateral damage in the sense that whenever Satan comes down in great wrath and there's a major flood or there's a hurricane or a tornado, people get wounded, people get injured, and some people even die. That's all part of the collateral damage between the spiritual warfare, between good versus evil, evil versus good. But what you don't understand and this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that it was the demonic force, wickedness, the Luciferian Lucifer himself, that challenged the kingdom of God, that started the warfare to begin with. In other words, it was this demonic figure that swung the first lick. And since then, it has been a battle. Since then, the fight has just begun. Now, one day, whenever all the smoke is cleared, whenever all the dust is cleared, whenever the whole planet has been destroyed and everything in the planet and on the planet has been destroyed, God will show himself in wiping away all our misery and all our torment and all our tears, and he will reconstruct and redesign a new heaven and a new earth, and that's where we will dwell with the Lord Jesus Christ in paradise, in heaven, and we will no longer have to worry about this evil demonic being called Lucifer that will be bringing trials and tribulations and temptations into our lives to the point of us ever being tempted to the degree of falling from grace to begin with. That's where the warfare is in each one of us, is trying to pull us away from the righteousness of God towards living for God versus living for the devil. And it is a constant struggle, depending upon what position that you play with, or it depends on what position that God has given you to play in this warfare of whether or not you're on the front of the lines or you're on the back of the lines. If you're on the back of the lines and you're really not striving towards full obedience with yourself, towards receiving the rewards as the prophets do, and as different chosen selected people will receive,
Our presidents, do you have any
then odds are you're not going to be tormented and you're not going to be humiliated and tried near as much as that person that is trying to strive towards those things. I wanted to finish that out. Please listen.
Is both have egregious items in them. None of these documents should have been out of a controlled environment, both the Biden documents and the Trump documents. We don't know the status of the Biden special counsel, although, as you know, the Trump matter is currently moving in court. It's certainly curious that we don't know what's going on in the Biden matter. They have limited the amount of documents that we have seen to those that they would suggest are not subject to executive privilege or the type of documents that we would normally see. We want to see them all. There are already documents that are listed in the Trump court pleadings that are described in detail that we have not yet seen, and we are pushing to make certain that they provide those to Congress.
But you have no reason to believe that they are in any way on equal footing in terms of the level of classification of documents, or do you have any?
I can tell you from the ones I've seen, they are equally egregious and equal classification issues, that both Biden documents and Trump documents have the equal concern and threat and equal classification.
I have so much more to ask you about, but I have to leave it there right now to go to this commercial break. Thank you, Congressman. We'll be right back. Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Mark.
I have to pick up where your Republican colleague just left off. Are the Trump and Biden classified documents that were in their personal possession and not in controlled areas equally egregious?
Well, Margaret, three things quickly. One, the administration took way too long to get us these documents. Two, while Mike and I have a great working relationship, I believe, based on the documents I've seen, that there is a difference in terms of the potential abuse that came from the Trump documents. And third, it's one of the reasons why I've got bipartisan legislation that would reform the whole classification process. We way overclassify. We frankly should have a process in place so that no president or vice president ever takes documents after they leave office. That is kind of lowest common fruit. We got to get that passed. We've got part of that in the Intel authorization bill. I hope it becomes the law of the land so we can prevent this from happening going forward.
You said based on documents you've seen, but you want to see more documents.
We have actually, I'm about at 98% satisfaction at this point.
98% satisfaction. There's a lot more on the national security front that we're tracking right now, including this potential prisoner swap with Iran to bring 5 Americans home. Are you comfortable with the trade?
I've not gotten the brief. The Senate Intel Committee has not gotten the brief. We will be getting it shortly.
Wasn't the staff briefed?
Well, I can tell you, I have not
You weren't.
personally briefed.
Okay.
I think we need to start with the premise it's always the policy of our country to try to bring back Americans who were held hostage. That was not only under Biden, it was Trump, it was Obama, Bush. I want to hear what kind of constraints are being put on in this exchange in terms of what has been reported of the $6 billion that was South Korean payments to Iran that would be released. I want to hear that and get those details before I weigh in further.
Because you have concern that money is fungible.
There is obviously money is fungible. The administration has said there are guardrails. I want to get a better description of those guardrails first.
You have been very active on artificial intelligence, and we talked about this back in January. Microsoft just announced a few days ago that China has a new capability to automatically generate images for use in influence operations to mimic American voters across the political spectrum and create controversy along racial, economic, and ideological lines. How much of a risk is this to our upcoming election?
It's an enormous risk. And artificial intelligence, I've spent as much time on this, I think, as any member of the Senate. And I never spent something where the more time I spend, in certain ways, the more confused I get. The whole economics around these large language models, which used to be, who had the most data, who had the most compute power would win, that fundamentally changed after Facebook released its so-called Llama model into the wild in the spring. We just had a major session Leader Schumer put together. It had the kind of the who's who in the room. And what I'm concerned at is even the AI leaders who say they want rules, guardrails, I'm concerned that when you actually put words on paper, will those major tech companies support that? Because you've seen we in social media have done zero. Now, in terms of China, China is a major player in AI, and where I think we ought to start, where AI tools, whether it comes from China or domestically, could have the most immediate effect would be the public's faith in our elections,
Right.
which Microsoft
And
just
if you're
cited.
gonna
But
legislate
hear me out.
election.
Hear me out on this. But the other area beyond elections is faith in our public markets. These same tools could completely disrupt the confidence in our public markets by using these same deep fake
Right.
tools. So I believe we ought to start, if we could put together an alliance between the capitalists and the small d Democrats, we might at least get guardrails coming in next year with the elections and with the concern about our markets.
So you're concerned not just about spooking, the stock market. We're talking about misleading people going into an election. Congress isn't going to legislate ahead of the election, are they? I think Leader Schumer said it's the most difficult thing we've ever undertaken.
This is why the notion of trying to solve it all, the bias questions, the whole question around deep fakes, the questions around what's called hallucination, where you get answers that have no relationship to what the question was asked. But we ought to at least start with some guardrails around trust in our public elections and trust in our public markets. There, I think we can move before our elections. I think it'll be bipartisan. Let's start on that framing point. I think we can all agree there could be huge disruption in both of those areas, and that's where I'm focused my time.
You may have heard our CBS polling there at the top of the program, and one of the data points I want to show you here says when people compare their finances now to how they were before the pandemic, by 2 to 1, they say they're worse, not better. And when they feel worse, they tell us they're voting for Donald Trump. How can President Biden win over those voters?
Well, I think we've seen from President Biden's actual record amounts of job growth coming again after COVID. We've seen major legislation that is now law in infrastructure, in the so-called CHIPS bill, and transition in our energy economy. And most of that has only been about 10 cents on every dollar spent out. So I think the positive effects of that will really continue to
Do
penetrate
people in
this coming
Virginia
year.
feel that you talk to?
I think there is a general feeling, oh my gosh, everybody seems to be at each other's throats here in Washington. The notion that we're going to potentially go into a government shutdown, Mike Turner and I work very closely together. But I wish the House leadership would be spending a little more time on what would happen with a government shutdown, which makes us look bad around the world. And frankly, in a state like mine in Virginia, where we have so many government workers, government contractors, it will be a disaster. And yet, the attention coming out of the House leadership is on impeachment and putting forward things they know will not ever pass the Senate in any kind of bipartisan fashion. And I think that is part of the underlying unease that voters feel.
So you believe we are headed for a government shutdown?
I would like to say no, but we're 8 or 9 days away, and we've not even been able to see the House pass the most basic defense appropriations bills. I hope and pray that Speaker McCarthy will say, hey, I'm going to throw over the far right, and I'm going to put together a bipartisan effort with the Democrats and mainstream Republicans to keep the government funding. I think that would get, again, 350, 400 votes.
Senator, good to have you here in person. We'll be back in a moment.
My family and I find
Really? Yeah.
February 2022 was like a lean on in the fear of nuclear conflict. Something I think all of us should look very carefully at and understand it.
Let's go back to the front. Sorry about that.
It's very important now.
Go back to the front. Right there.
750 bonus cash plus 1,000 trade assist on a 2023 F-150. Only at your local Ford dealer.
60 minutes.
60 minutes.
60 minutes.
60 minutes. Season premiere tonight on CBS.
Actor and director Sean Penn is the co-director of a new documentary called Superpower. It's about President Zelensky and the war in Ukraine. Zelensky agreed to meet with Penn in person for the first time on camera on the same day Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Great that you are here. It's very important now, all this support. And I think your voice, the voice of the advice, I think Americans has to hear. So I think you see that we are just ordinary people who wants to live in our country. Yeah, and now when you hear, it's so dangerous
to be here at this time in this country with you, with your countrymen. I mean, there's so much inspiration to be had here.
We spoke with Penn on Friday about his new film. In one of the clips, Andrei Yermak, one of the top advisors to President Zelensky, says to you, the U.S. position should be stronger. If the United States and Joe Biden doesn't do something now, essentially he says America's over. That followed with a pretty robust financial investment by the United States, more than $50 billion, pledges of weapons. But from what I've heard you say, you think the United States isn't doing enough.
It is my absolute feeling that the caution with which the United States has pledged support, which seemed, in my reading of February 2022, was like a lean on in the fear of nuclear conflict. Something I think all of us should look very carefully at and understand it, of course, is possible, and that's to be concerning. The likelihood is extremely low, and as one of our witnesses in the film says, are we going to let a gangster with nuclear weapons dictate the way we live? So I think that the Ukrainians won't let him do that.
In the documentary, you spoke with a Ukrainian fighter pilot named Juice, who I understand was killed later in a training incident. Was your personal connection to him and the case he made to you part of why you are pushing this point on F-16 so strongly?
I was pushing it when I was with Juice and he was alive. He dreamt of flying F-16s. I think that he was a man who was born into a time where he had to do this extreme thing. He did it with poise and skill and focus and compassion. And so he had come to Washington to lobby for the F-16s and also was buying helmets for his helicopter pilot friends on eBay here to bring back. So it was like that. And then I suppose now, was it July that it was announced that there would now be an F-16 program, those resources were coming.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah, over a long period of time. And a couple of weeks later, I got the message that he'd been killed. I think not only would Juice be alive today, if we had been as bold as we like to claim to be historically as a country, with our principles, with our Republicans and our Democrats, with our leadership. The citizenry too, while we were putting all those Ukrainian flags out, we should have demand decisiveness in this case, because at some point, caution becomes cowardice. But there's still an opportunity for us to do the right thing.
58% of Americans polled by CBS disapprove of the way Joe Biden is handling the situation with Russia and Ukraine. And I'm getting the sense from you, you're disappointed too.
Yeah, I respect President Biden very much. There have been a couple of things that I think have been disasters up to this point. There should be an implicit understanding between private citizens and leaders in government that, there are things that I don't know about, things that need to remain classified.
Right.
So every day, even when I was with Juice, I was privately thinking, yes, it's our job to fight this fight. But privately, I was thinking, but maybe they're doing it behind closed doors, and tomorrow we're going to wake up to that squadron. Enough time has passed. I think it's been, to date, a tragic mistake, and I hope and encourage this president that he deserves the legacy of doing this properly.
Polling also shows big majorities of Americans continue to support economic sanctions on Russia. 61% of Republicans, though, say the U.S. should not send weapons to Ukraine. 50% say the U.S. should not send aid and supplies to Ukraine. That is a big shift from where the Republican Party was in terms of, in the past, being very strong on Russia. But some of it, in terms of the rhetoric, reflects this sense that America needs to fix itself at home. How do you respond to that thinking?
I think there's more than a compelling argument that would change those minds. And I understand why they're confused. I mean, I'm hoping in its little way that this film can help context. I would be confused if I hadn't had the opportunity to do this.
Better communication of the why and the justification
I think
for the billions of dollars of American
if the
spending.
current leadership would just do one thing now, it would be the president saying to his cabinet, we are not spinning the story on Ukraine anymore. So if it's about what are they capable of, we're going to let our commanders in Fresno at the Cal National Guard that's been doing joint military exercises with them for 30 years tell us what their capability is. And we're going to say it unfiltered to the American people.
You end the documentary talking about this feeling of unity you had when you were in Ukraine, and you compare it to what you see here at home. And you actually end on the images of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, and Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia. And you say, we're going backwards. Why do you think they symbolize that?
I think that we've come to a point where we as the voters, we as the citizens have to look at our politicians and say, look, you're very smart. We agree with your policy. Why would you want to call it socialist? Why would you want to put up a middle finger to people who have a reaction to that? You're a leader. Just get the policy across. I'm not interested in these people self-celebrating or grandstanding. Jerks like me do enough of that. Leaders can't do that anymore. And so on the right, on the left, we have to demand that people actually are accountable accountable and ourselves for the division that we have and break it.
Thank you, Sean Penn, for sharing your work with us. And Superpower debuts on Paramount Plus on Monday. We'll be right back.
I didn't know nothing about that Superpowers thing. I told them from day one that they needed to approach this situation completely, totally different, because you was no longer dealing with a bunch of goat herders like over in Afghanistan. I told them from day one, within 72 hours, I was giving out that advisory, that warning, that this needs to be handled on a completely different scale. You know, we've had so many different controlled wars. And whenever I say controlled wars, I'm talking about underhanding or undermining the American people, and basically people making deals in behind closed doors that the American people never finds out about until years and years later, kind of like the Vietnam War or some of the other wars that we've went through. And it's really sad that the American people gets lied to and isn't told up front towards why are we even engaged in this? Why are we sacrificing blood and sweat, blood, and tears pertaining to this? Why is this occurring? And what business is it of ours to intervene? Whenever you have politicians that play with the American people, undermine the American people, that get us in the position that we're in right now, I personally feel like that some people need to be held accountable. Just like what he was talking about.
That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. Tune in to 60 Minutes tonight for its season premiere for an interview with Ukraine's President Zelensky right after football. Until next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.
Good luck to all of us. Shalom.